Hello, welcome to our Sunday morning edition of The Papers. With me are Stephen Bush, who's assistant comment editor at The Telegraph, and the freelance journalist Kunal Dutta. Good morning to you both. Before we speak to them, let's take a quick look at some of the front pages of today's newspapers. The Observer leads with the planned demonstration in Paris in response to the city's worst terror attacks in half a century. That demonstration is expected to attract up to 1 million people, including many world leaders. The Mail on Sunday has more about the woman wanted in connection with the attacks. The paper says police surveillance of Hayat Boumediene and her accomplices stopped 6 months ago because they were deemed low risk. The Sunday Telegraph has details of the acts of bravery carried out by the hostages in the supermarket siege, including those who died at the scene. The Sunday Express leads with a warning that Britain could be attacked next. It says SAS troops are being used to defend Britain's streets from similar plots. And the Sunday Times carries the terror alert over 150 UK jihadists as its main story, and it also reports on the fear of copycat attacks. So let's begin. Let's start with the Sun on Sunday. Stephen, perhaps you do this first. Nice clear headline here: new SAS force to fight jihadis. Actually, when you read it, of course, it's sort of being suggested or planned. Just tell us what seems to be involved here.
Well, the suggestion is that the SAS will be beefed up, because at the moment it's a 500-strong force. It's an elite, but it's also quite a small elite, which means that if we are living in an era of a permanently increased terror threat, where we might have hostage crises and attacks similar to the ones seen in Paris here in Britain, the SAS as it exists is not quite big enough to deal with the scale of that challenge. So The Sun is carrying a story about a new SAS-led counter-terrorism force, effectively a beefing up of the SAS as it is now, so it's bigger and more able to respond to multiple threats.
Does this sound, Kunal, like we're going to see, as you do in Paris? I mean, for quite a few years now, you go to Paris, you see soldiers walking about with guns in railway stations and so on. It sounds as though that might come here.
Well, I think we've seen it before in the wake of incidents like 7/7. You know, every time you have an attack of this sort, it is necessary that part of the reassurance mechanism to the country is to have soldiers out in the street. That doesn't mean they have to necessarily be live and active. It just means they need to be there as a way to sort of reassure people that there is a sort of immediate government response to this, rather than just policy, which, you know, takes a lot longer to push through.
Do you think it's, I mean, are we in danger a bit here of the old knee-jerk reaction, must do something, let's beef this up, let's do this sort of thing?
I think, again, it's reassurance on one hand, but I do think that there is a need as well to prepare the country for the fact that terrorist attacks are part now of the world we live in. And, you know, I think Andrew Parker, the head of MI5 last week, kind of, the tone of his conversation was, you know, don't be surprised if at some point something does fall through the nets, which inevitably might do.
Yeah. Interesting, Stephen, I was reading this in the Sun here. It talks, Chancellor George's right down in the middle pages here, when they've got a lot of stuff inside, as so many papers have, about what was happening, the people who did amazing things when they were surrounded by these awful people and so forth and taken hostage. But there's a little story down in the corner here which is the follow-on to the front page story, and I notice it says there that the Chancellor George Osborne has said that cash for security will be no object. Well, there would be no objective to it anyway, no objection to it. But actually, security money has actually been cut back in the last few years. I mean, are we thinking that there's going to be a change of that, and should there be?
I mean, obviously there has been a fairly radical swinging back of spending on the security service, as there's been with everything else. I imagine the political pressure, both from within politics and also, more importantly, from the voters, for there to be seen to be a response, for some reassurance, and also, if we are living in an era when this is the new normal, you know, it does cost more. So I suspect that, yes, some of those cuts will have to be put into reverse. I think they probably should, actually.
OK, right, OK. And then the Sunday Express, very, very similar theme, isn't it? There, another nice, clear headline, Kunal. SAS rushed in to guard our streets.
Yeah, and again, it's always interesting, isn't it? I think the police and security services do an incredible job as it is, but somehow we always need to have, you know, the next level up. So this time it's it's the SAS. In America, you know, it was the Navy SEALs that were the ones that finally, you know, attacked bin Laden. It's sort of this language of, you know, here's one team, but there's another one, and this is the crack team, and that's what this is doing.
But there's been a lot of headlines, Kunal, haven't there? And they're repeated again inside the Sunday Express this time. Said, "You are next, Islamic extremist warns UK." I mean, this is the fear. It's the copycat thing that everybody goes on about.
It is, and you know, those of us that follow sort of the events in Syria and Iraq and the sort of growing global jihadi threat, it's not new. They've been saying this for a long, long time, and you know, one of the things we risk doing is every time we sort of give that message credence, we are effectively doing their PR for them. We know there's a terrorist threat. There's been a terrorist threat ever since, you know, 9/11, even before that. But more and more we have to be seen to be responding to events that happen around the world, and when they do happen, there's always a need to bring it back to Britain. Britain is under a terrorist threat. There is talk possibly of the terrorist threat level, you know, rising in the next couple of weeks. It should, depending on how things go in France in the next day or so.
Indeed. And Stephen, the other thing, we had a specialist talking about all this security business, saying, emphasising this difficulty of keeping an eye on people, even when you sort of suspect them. It's so difficult to know who they are and how, because the people in France, apparently, they were being watched very carefully, and then they thought, oh, well, they're not much of a risk. It's a definitely difficult business, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, these are horrendous calls that, I think most of us are very glad we don't have to make. Because is someone being suspicious? Is someone on the road to becoming a threat? Yeah, the slightly scary. I mean, there are lots of very scary things about this story, but this is a departure from the lone wolf attacks of sort of a lone nutter on the internet getting a knife. They had clearly put some thought and preparation to it. They were trained. They attacked with almost military precision. So it kind of once again shows the difficulty that the security services have. And of course the challenge of balancing those difficulties without giving away too many freedoms, without having an excessive amount of surveillance in our lives.
Now then, let's turn to another newspaper, The Independent on Sunday. Those of us who sit here and review papers on Sundays know The Independent very often has a different line, but actually today they're more or less with everybody else. But they're focusing very much on how France now feels and what's going to be happening with demonstrations and so on. Their headline there, France shattered, then brought together. Kunal, I mean, it's going to be quite an amazing day, isn't it?
I think it very much will be, and I think in terms of the march taking place today in Paris, it will be a real sign straight away as to what the new sort of post-attack Paris and indeed France will look like. There's so many things in French politics at the moment that are hanging in the balance. You know, President Hollande's leadership was under a lot of question before this. There was the rise of the far right, which is sweeping across parts of Europe, and then you have something like this, which is an attack as well, as they say, on freedom of speech. So these things all sort of coming together in this perfect storm will really sort of test not just how resilient France are, but also how are they going to actually, you know, respond to it. Is it going to be fear, you know, panic, or is it going to be a more sort of measured show of solidarity and unity? And let's hope it is the latter.
Because, Stephen, the strands in France are the particular ones, aren't they? Anti-Semitism, for example. There's talk that an awful lot of Jewish people in France, big Jewish community, but would actually like to leave the country, and this is only going to make them even more nervous.
Well, there's been a rising tide of anti-Semitic attacks in France over the last few years. I've seen reports in the outside of something like 80% of the country's Jews, and obviously the difficulty in France is because it is forbidden by their constitution to collect data about what the exact racial makeup of a country is. It's harder for them in some ways to pinpoint when a problem is starting. If there was a sudden spike of anti-Semitic attacks here, we might have a slightly flat-footed public response, but at least people would be able to point to the data and go, look, here's a big problem. But it does seem as if the result of this mounting series of attacks is that France's Jewish population is scared, it's nervous, and it's thinking about leaving either to America, to Israel, or in some cases to Britain. We forget, because we talk a lot about Polish immigrants, but actually one of the largest migrant inflows into Britain over the last couple of years has been French people.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, parts of London. I mean, I must say, French is the language you hear on the street almost. These call them demonstrations. I mean, demonstrations are usually rather angry things. It's a complete opposite, Kunal, isn't it? Today, it's a show of solidarity. Saw some yesterday. There's a picture. I think that must be the south of France. It's like Nice or somewhere like that, isn't it? But Paris today, more than 1 million people. All these world leaders coming together. An extraordinary demonstration.
Quite, and also, I mean, of course, you know, the sort of Western European leaders, David Cameron, Angela Merkel, you expect to see them, but there's also word that Mahmoud Abbas of Palestine will potentially be there as well. And I think those sort of cues will be very heavily assessed when we do actually see what the sort of response is, because, as Stephen was saying, I mean, there is many questions to be asked about society in France at the moment, and what it needs more than anything is a sort of a cross show of solidarity. So when we say "Je suis Charlie," it's not just I am about Charlie Hebdo the cartoon. It's I am standing in unity with with other citizens in France, regardless of race, colour, or creed.
Indeed, and the Sunday Telegraph here. We've got to your own paper there, Stephen. Heroism and hatred. I mean, that's the thing that's now emerging. People who did extraordinary things. Person who tried to grab hold of a gun got killed in the supermarket. Very cool-headed boss of that print works. There's some amazing stories coming out, isn't it? Just sheer journalistic stories.
Yeah, and it's yeah, in an odd way, the kind of comforting thing about the awful events of the last week have been these small stories about individual heroism, about people, you know, taking a risk for someone else. This the Muslim shop worker at the kosher supermarket who hid some of the hostages in the fridge, and it looks as if by hiding those hostages, that's the reason why those 4 hostages got out alive. And then this gentleman who tried to seize a gun, sadly it jammed, and then he was shot by one of the hostage takers. But in an odd way, it's quite comforting to realise that while we've seen our capacity for savagery over the last week, we've also seen our capacity for better.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to move on just to one last story, not about the events in France and everything else is going on. There seems to be an election campaign underway already. And I think last time you and I discussed this matter. It's coming to us, isn't it? It's an awfully long way off in some ways, but here it is. And it's George Osborne, front page of the Sunday Times, said that he's going to slash inheritance tax and rule out a rise in VAT. Here we go.
And not just here we go, but here we go almost back to 2010. You sort of remember this being the rallying call for a while on inheritance tax and then raising that threshold, which seemed to sort of go down sort of relatively well. Stephen and I were discussing earlier, but it
never happened. Because the reality was never happened at all.
Because he was trapped in a coalition with the Lib Dems who sort of blocked it from happening. But of all the sort of thinking that's gone behind the Tories and basing a lot of their election strategy on the economy, this feels to me like a sort of slightly random one to raise. I mean, they want to challenge Ed Miliband to say, you know, we are in touch with everyday people, and the sort of inheritance tax argument feels a bit old.
And do you agree? A bit too old, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a return to what was seen as a greatest hit. It forced Gordon Brown to reconsider holding that snap election. But the number one thing
seems so long ago. But you're right.
the number one thing the focus group said in the run up to the 2010 election, which had all of the Conservative strategists holding their heads and going, oh God, was the Conservatives are a party who look out for their rich friends. You can make a good principled argument against inheritance tax. You can make a good principled argument for inheritance tax. But from a political perspective, I don't see how it is a good place for the Conservatives to put the ball to, like, we're the people who give money to the rich. I think if I was going to talk about tax-cutting priorities and I was trying to advise the Conservatives how to get a majority or how to be the largest party, you'd think maybe tax relief for small businesses, for people on basic rate, might be a better message to send. And it kind of feeds into this big area of Tory weakness, I think.
Well, the Telegraph tends to be the people who do sort of basically support the Tories and give them advice, and perhaps they should listen. But on the other hand, going back to what happened in 2010, I seem to remember a big bounce in the opinion polls in the Conservatives' favour when Osborne stood up at the party conference, wasn't it, and said we're going to raise the level to 1 million.
Yeah, of course, there's an interesting debate about whether or not that was the ending of the brown bounce, which would have happened anyway, as people went, oh, you're new, oh, actually, I'm a bit bored of you now, or if it was the tax cut promise itself. I think the big problem is if they delivered the tax cut last time, then this one might be a bit more successful. Yes, it's because of the coalition, but I feel they've lost a lot of trust on their ability to promise these things and then deliver them, because no one really thinks that either party will have a majority. So I suspect that when Ed Miliband says, I'll have a living standards index, as he's saying elsewhere today, or George Osborne says, I'll do this, everyone goes, but mate, you're not going to get a majority, are you? And so people kind of go, well, are you really going to get that through the Lib Dems? And I suspect with this promise, because people don't think it will get through the Lib Dems, it won't have the same effect it had last time on the Tory poll share.
There's going to be an awful lot of these promises to come. Stephen Bush and Kunal Dutta, thank you both very, very much indeed. Just a reminder, we take a look at tomorrow's front pages. Today we do today's, but we look at tomorrow's front pages every evening during the week at 10:30 and 11:30 here on BBC News.